Subscribe our channel for more videos.
It is 3 in the morning, November 8, 1942, Richmond, California. 1,000 workers are standing in the dark, their breath fogging in the cold bay air, welding torches blazing like a constellation of blue-white stars against the night sky. They are not soldiers, they are not sailors, they are farmers, housewives, former grocery clerks. A man who was fixing car engines in Kansas 6 weeks ago is now laying steel on what will become a weapon that changes the outcome of the entire war. And in 4 days, not 4 months, not 4 years, 4 days, a fully operational cargo ship will slide into San Francisco Bay. The maritime experts said it was physically impossible. Henry Kaiser had never built a ship in his life, and that was exactly why he was about to shatter 3,000 years of shipbuilding tradition into pieces so small they would never be put back together again. Here is something the history books almost never tell you. In 1941, Germany was not just winning the war on the battlefield, it was winning it in the ocean. Every single week, German U-boats were sliding silently beneath the surface of the Atlantic and tearing apart Allied supply lines with a ruthless, surgical precision that was genuinely terrifying. Ships loaded with food, ammunition, fuel, and medicine were disappearing beneath the waves faster than anything or anyone could replace them. Britain was not simply struggling, Britain was starving. In 1941 alone, approximately 3.6 million tons of Allied shipping sank to the bottom of the ocean. The math was brutal and simple. Germany was sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. And if that math did not change, if someone did not find a way to reverse it, the war was already over. The Allies just did not know it yet. The traditional shipyards of America looked at this crisis and gave an answer that was honest and devastating. They needed 230 days to build a single cargo vessel. That was not laziness, that was not incompetence, that was 3 centuries of accumulated maritime wisdom speaking through engineers and master shipwrights who had spent their entire careers learning a craft so complex it was practically a religion. Ships were not manufactured, ships were built. There was a difference, they insisted, and only a fool or an outsider would fail to see it. A hull was not an automobile chassis. Steel plates joined by rivets hammered by men whose fathers had taught them how was not an assembly line operation. It was a tradition. It was an art form. It was a sacred inheritance passed down through generations of men who smelled of salt water and knew things in their bones that no textbook could ever teach. And then Henry Kaiser walked into the room. Understand who this man was, because his background is not a footnote, it is the entire point. Kaiser was 58 years old in 1940. He had spent his career moving earth. He built roads, he built dams, the Hoover Dam, the Grand Coulee Dam. The man had poured more concrete than almost any human being who ever lived, and he had done it faster and cheaper than anyone thought possible every single time. He did not know what a ship was made of beyond steel and ambition. He had never managed a shipyard. He had never studied naval architecture. He had never spent a single day learning the traditions and techniques that maritime experts treated as sacred law. On December 27, 1940, this man, this concrete pourer, this road builder, this complete and total stranger to the ocean, walked into a meeting with the United States Maritime Commission and promised to build 30 cargo vessels for the British government within 2 years. The men in that room were polite enough not to laugh out loud, but the laughter came later in private offices and gentlemen's clubs from men who had dedicated their lives to the sea and could not imagine being lectured about ships from someone who had never seen one built. What they did not understand, what they could not understand because their entire worldview depended on not understanding it, was that Kaiser's ignorance was not a weakness, it was the most dangerous weapon in the room. When Kaiser and his engineers sat down in early 1941 to study traditional shipbuilding methods, they did something that experienced shipbuilders had stopped doing decades earlier. They looked at everything with fresh eyes and asked a question that sounds almost childishly simple, but was actually revolutionary. Why? Why do you do it this way? Why does the engine go in after the hull is complete? Why do rivets have to be used instead of welding? Why does it take 230 days? And the answer, over and over again, when you stripped away the tradition and the expertise and the professional pride, was essentially because that is how it has always been done. That answer, to a man who had never been told how things were always done in shipbuilding, was not a reason, it was an invitation. Kaiser's chief engineer was a man named Clay Bedford. Bedford had visited a Ford Motor Company assembly line in Detroit just weeks before the planning began, and what he saw there did something to his brain that he couldn't stop thinking about. He watched automobile chassis move down a production line. He watched workers at each station install prefabricated components, the same components in the same way, with a speed and efficiency that seemed almost supernatural compared to what traditional manufacturing looked like. Bedford came back to California with an idea that the shipbuilding world would have considered not just wrong, but offensive. What if you built a ship the way Ford built a car? What if you didn't build it from bottom to top in sequence, but built all the pieces simultaneously in different parts of the facility, and then assembled them with massive cranes and joined them together? What if a ship was not built, but assembled? The traditional shipbuilder's reaction to this idea tells you everything you need to know about the difference between expertise and wisdom. They did not engage with the logic. They did not examine whether it might work. They simply said, "Ships are not automobiles. That is not how this is done." And they walked away, certain that the argument was over. It was not over. It was just beginning. The Richmond shipyard rose from empty California mudflats between January and December 1941, and what Kaiser built there was enough to give a traditional maritime engineer genuine nightmares. John Riley was the chief naval architect of Bethlehem Steel Corporation. He had 30 years of shipbuilding experience. He visited Richmond in May 1941, and his confidential inspection report, eventually declassified and preserved, is one of the most fascinating documents of the entire war because of what it reveals about the collision between tradition and revolution. Riley wrote that Kaiser had violated every principle of efficient shipyard layout he had learned in 30 decades. The prefabrication areas were too large, the crane capacity was absurdly excessive, the building ways were too short, and then, in the same document, this 30-year veteran admitted something that must have cost him something real to write. He admitted that despite violating every principle he knew, the facility was designed exactly for what Kaiser claimed: rapid assembly of prefabricated sections. Riley knew what he was looking at. He just couldn't believe it would work.
The facility was not designed to look like a shipyard. It was designed to look like something between an automobile plant and a military logistics operation. Open prefabrication areas surrounded 7 parallel building ways. Railroad tracks crisscross the entire facility, designed to move massive steel sections weighing up to 150 tons. Overhead cranes capable of lifting entire ship sections were positioned every 100 feet. The scale was almost theatrical. Kaiser was not just building a shipyard, he was building an argument, a physical demonstration of a philosophy, and every design choice was a sentence in the manifesto. Now here is where the story becomes something that goes beyond industrial history and enters the territory of genuine human drama. Because the next question was not just about steel and cranes and welding techniques. The next question was about people. Who was going to build these ships? Traditional shipyards pulled their workers from tight-knit maritime communities. Sons learned from fathers. Apprentices spent 4 years learning the fundamentals of the craft, and another 6 becoming masters. The knowledge was almost tribal, passed down through physical demonstration and years of accumulated practice. The American shipbuilding workforce in 1941 was skilled, experienced, and finite. There were not enough trained shipbuildings in the country to staff Kaiser's operation, let alone the expanded production the war demanded. So Kaiser did something that the maritime establishment found almost incomprehensible. He put advertisements in newspapers across America. He offered wages 20% above standard industrial rates, and he promised to train anyone willing to work. Anyone. No experience necessary, no background required, no special qualifications. If you were willing to show up and learn, Kaiser would teach you. What showed up in Richmond, California in August 1941 was America. Former farmers from Kansas, secretaries from Chicago, housewives from small towns in the South and Midwest who had never held anything heavier than a kitchen pan. African American workers from states where they had been systematically excluded from skilled industrial work for generations. Young women who had been told their entire lives that heavy industry was not for them, and who discovered, in the blue-white light of a welding torch in a California shipyard, that they had been lied to. By October 1941, Kaiser employed over 10,000 workers in Richmond. Fewer than 200 had any previous maritime experience. The traditional shipbuilding world looked at this workforce and saw a disaster waiting to happen. What they were actually looking at was the most powerful industrial labor force ever assembled, and they did not recognize it because they were looking at it through the wrong lens. Kaiser's training programs did something brilliant that ran directly counter to everything the maritime establishment believed about skill development. Traditional apprenticeships tried to create complete craftsmen, workers who understood every aspect of shipbuilding, from keel to mast. The theory was that comprehensive understanding produced better work. Kaiser rejected this theory entirely. His instructors did not try to teach workers how to build a ship. They taught workers how to do one specific thing: how to weld vertical seams on bulkheads, how to weld horizontal deck plates, how to curved hull sections. Not everything, one thing. And they could teach that one thing in approximately 2 weeks, because when you strip out all the context and tradition and comprehensive knowledge and reduce a complex skill to its most repeatable core element, the learning curve collapses. The fastest training programs were producing productive spot welders in 10 days. 10 days from walking in off the street to performing a skilled industrial task that traditional apprenticeships had required 4 years to teach. The maritime establishment called this dangerous oversimplification. Kaiser called it efficiency. The ships that came out of the process would eventually settle the argument. What happened next in the winter and spring of 1942 is the kind of thing that would seem impossible if the production records had survived to prove it. Kaiser's first Liberty ship took 197 days to build. The second took 169 days. The fifth took 128 days. The 10th took 97 days. The numbers were falling with a speed that should not have been possible according to every model of industrial learning that maritime experts had ever developed. By spring of 1942, Richmond was completing Liberty ships in 70 days on average. The traditional shipyards, staffed by experienced craftsmen who had spent their careers perfecting this work, watched with a combination of alarm and something approaching existential dread, because their highly skilled professional crews were building ships at roughly the same pace as Kaiser's workforce of farmers and former housewives who had learned to weld 6 months earlier. The reason the numbers kept falling was something that Kaiser's team called learning curve efficiency, but that was really something more fundamental than that. Every time a worker performed their specific task, welding that vertical bulkhead seam, fitting that deck plate, operating that crane, they got better at it. Not in a general way, but in the specific, granular, micro-optimized way that comes from pure repetition. They found better angles. They developed better rhythms. They discovered small efficiencies that shaved minutes off a process that they performed hundreds of times, and those minutes accumulated into hours, and those hours accumulated into days, and those days accumulated into the statistical miracle that Vice Admiral Howard Vickery, Vice Chairman of the Maritime Commission, had to eventually acknowledge despite his initial fierce resistance. Vickery was a career naval officer. He was the kind of man who believed in precision, in standards, in the institutional knowledge. When Kaiser's team asked to reduce drawing specifications, to simplify the detailed plans that specified every element of construction, Vickery fought it.
"Ships are not automobiles," he wrote in January of 1942, echoing the maritime establishment's favorite argument. But by March, Kaiser's yards were outproducing traditional contractors by 40%. By June, the gap had widened to 70%, and Vickery, to his enormous credit, did something that requires real intellectual courage. He changed his mind. He wrote later that he had learned that perfection is the enemy of sufficient. Kaiser ships were not beautiful, they were adequate, and adequate ships delivered more cargo than perfect ships still under construction. That sentence, "adequate ships delivered more cargo than perfect ships still under construction," is one of the most important sentences of the entire Second World War, because it captures something that the Allied command had been struggling to articulate about the nature of industrial warfare. The enemy was not Germany's tactical genius. The enemy was Germany's submarines and the mathematics of attrition. Germany did not need to build beautiful ships. Germany needed to sink ships faster than the Allies could replace them. Kaiser's revolution was a direct answer to that specific mathematical problem, delivered not through military strategy, but through manufacturing innovation. Let us pause for a moment and think about what Albert Wooding, the production supervisor at Richmond Yard No. 2, explained about parallel production, because it is genuinely mind-bending once you grasp it fully. In traditional shipbuilding, you can't install the engine until the engine room is complete. You can't complete the engine room until the hull is built. Everything happens in strict sequence, like a chain where each link must be completed before the next one can begin. This means that at any given moment, most of your workforce is waiting for the previous step to finish so they can begin their step. The shipyard is always partially idle, even when it looks busy, because the nature of sequential construction means that half the tasks can't begin until the other half are done.
Kaiser's approach eliminated waiting. While one crew was welding hull plates on the building way, a separate crew was assembling the engine in an open workshop on the other side of the facility. While that was happening, another crew was building the bow section in a prefabrication area. The stern section was going up simultaneously. The cargo holds were being constructed in parallel. The deck house was being fabricated while the propeller shaft was being installed in what would eventually be the stern. Nothing waited for anything else. The entire ship was being built at once, in pieces, across every inch of the facility. And when the pieces were ready, the cranes lifted them together and the welding crews joined them in a process that looked less like traditional shipbuilding and more like assembling an enormous three-dimensional puzzle. The statistics that resulted from this approach were enough to make a conventional maritime engineer question his sanity. A traditional shipyard might assign 50 workers to install an engine over 3 weeks, working in the cramped and difficult conditions of a partially complete engine room. Kaiser's approach assigned 200 workers to assemble the complete engine in an open workshop over 5 days, then used cranes to position the entire assembly in a single 8-hour operation. The math works out to something like a 10-fold improvement in efficiency, and the 10-fold improvement was not theoretical. It showed up in the production records week after week, in numbers that the United States Maritime Commission eventually stopped questioning and started simply celebrating. But something even more important than production efficiency was happening in the Kaiser shipyards, something that the business executives and military officials focused on tonnage numbers almost missed entirely. A social revolution was occurring on those mudflats in Richmond, California, and in Portland, Oregon, and in the Kaiser yards scattered across the Pacific Northwest. By peak production in 1944, Kaiser's 7 yards employed approximately 196,000 workers. Of those, over 40,000 were women. By mid-1944, women comprised 27% of Richmond's production workforce. African-American workers numbered in the tens of thousands, employed not in the marginal support roles that most American industry had historically confined them to, but in skilled positions, welding, fitting, crane operation, even supervisory roles. This level of workplace integration was not merely unusual for 1940s America. In much of the country, it was legally restricted or socially prohibited.
Kaiser implemented it anyway, not out of idealism alone, but because he had made a promise to build ships and he needed workers. And the workers who showed up included everyone the traditional industrial economy had been ignoring. Think about what this meant for these individuals. There were women in those shipyards who had spent their entire adult lives being told that their role was domestic and their capabilities were limited. There were African American men and women who had been systematically excluded from skilled industrial work for generations, denied apprenticeships, denied union membership, denied the opportunity to demonstrate what they were actually capable of. In the Kaiser shipyards, those exclusions dissolved under the pressure of wartime necessity and Kaiser's practical philosophy. You could weld? Kaiser would teach you how and pay you a good wage. That was the entire criterion. And what happened when those people who had been told their whole lives that they were not capable of skilled industrial work were given the training and the opportunity? They built ships faster than anyone had ever built ships before. It was not a complicated lesson. It was a devastating one. The competition that developed among Kaiser's 7 yards in the fall of 1942 tells you something important about the culture Kaiser built. His son, Edgar, managed the Pacific Northwest facilities. Clay Bedford oversaw the Richmond yards in California. These two men began an informal competition to see whose facility could build ships faster. And what started as professional rivalry became a public phenomenon. Newspapers published updates like sports scores. Records fell and were broken again. Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation built the Joseph N. Teal in just 10 days in September 1942, cutting the previous record nearly in half. The workers celebrated like their team had won a championship, because in the culture Kaiser had created, that was essentially what it was. Vice Admiral Vickery eventually ordered the speed competitions stopped, calling them stunt demonstrations that distracted from actual production goals. He was technically correct and strategically wrong. The competition had done something to the psychological atmosphere of the Kaiser yards that no production memo or management directive could have accomplished. It had made the workers believe, not theoretically, not aspirationally, but in their bones, the way a veteran shipwright believed in rivet techniques, that extraordinary speed was not just possible, but expected, that this was what they did, that this was who they were. The culture of the impossible had taken root. And then November 1942 arrived, and Clay Bedford heard Vice Admiral Land make an offhand comment to a group of journalists that the recent speed records, while impressive, still paled compared to what true mass production had achieved in other industries. Bedford heard the remark. Bedford took it personally, and Bedford walked over to Vice Admiral Land and made an offer that by any reasonable measure should have been refused. He told the Admiral that Richmond Yard No. 2 would attempt to build a complete Liberty ship from keel laying to launch in under 10 days. Under 10 days. The Joseph N. Teal's record was 10 days. Bedford was proposing to cut that record in half. Land, to his credit, was skeptical but intrigued rather than dismissive, and he authorized the attempt on one condition: it could not disrupt regular production schedules. Bedford agreed. He selected the 47th hull to be built at Yard No. 2. The ship would be named the SS Robert E. Peary, after the Arctic explorer. And starting at 1 minute past midnight on Sunday, November 8th, over 1,000 workers in carefully coordinated shifts would attempt something that no one in maritime history had ever attempted before. What Bedford and his team had done in the weeks before the attempt began was take the prefabrication philosophy that Kaiser had developed and push it to its absolute logical extreme. Every single major component of the ship had been built, inspected, and staged before the keel touched the building way. Not most components, every component. The bow section, comprising more than 50 individual pieces, had been fully welded and equipped with anchor hardware, chain lockers, and forward crew quarters before assembly even began. The stern section included the completed steering gear, propeller shaft, and aft crew spaces. 4 complete cargo holds, each one a massive rectangular steel structure, were ready to be lifted into position the moment the hull was ready to receive them. The engine, 140-ton triple-expansion steam power plant, had been mounted on its foundation structure and tested before it ever left the factory in Sunnyvale. When the assembly process began, these were not raw materials waiting to be shaped. They were finished components waiting to be joined.
The scene at Richmond Yard No. 2 during those 4 days and 15 hours was something that no one who witnessed it ever entirely forgot. The welding torches created a constant constellation of blue-white light across the yard, visible from miles away in the California night. Workers moved through the facility in coordinated shifts that had been planned with the precision of a military operation, each crew knowing exactly what they were doing, exactly when to begin, exactly when the next crew would take over. The massive overhead cranes moved sections that weighed more than most houses through the darkness and set them down with an accuracy that seemed impossible given their scale. When the bow section descended onto the building way, there was a moment, workers who were there later described it, when the entire crew seemed to hold its breath. Then the section landed perfectly. The welding crews moved in immediately, and the ship that would become the SS Robert E. Peary continued its impossible journey toward completion. 4 days into the construction, the hull was complete. The engine had been installed, the deck houses were positioned, the cargo holds were secured, the steering gear was mounted. Maritime experts who visited the site during the attempt kept expecting to find some crucial element missing, some corner that had been cut, some essential system that had been staged for appearance but not actually functional. They kept not finding it, because Bedford and his team had understood something that the critics had not. The point was not to make the ship look complete in 4 days. The point was to make it actually complete in 4 days. Everything that went into a Liberty ship had to be there. It just had to be built differently and assembled differently than anything the maritime world had ever seen. On Thursday, November 12, 1942, at 3:30 in the afternoon, the SS Robert E. Peary slid down the launching rails into San Francisco Bay. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after the keel had touched the building way. The crowd of observers on the shore included maritime officials, military officers, competing shipyard owners, and journalists from across America. Many of them had arrived expecting to see either a failure or a show, a ship that looked complete from the outside but was essentially an empty shell, a publicity stunt dressed up in steel. What they saw instead was a fully operational vessel that required only minor fitting out before entering service. 3 days later, on November 15th, the Robert E. Peary was delivered for service, setting a second record of 7 days, 14 hours, and 32 minutes from keel laying to full operational delivery. Vice Admiral Land was present for the launching. He had been skeptical from the moment Bedford had proposed the attempt. He had authorized it with conditions designed to minimize disruption, half expecting the attempt to fail or at least to reveal serious limitations. What he said when the ship hit the water, recorded by newsreel cameras that were broadcasting to movie theaters across America, was the sound of an institution acknowledging its own defeat. He said that 6 months ago he would have called this impossible. He said that traditional shipbuilding wisdom, accumulated over 3,000 years, said you cannot build a proper ship in 5 days. And then he said the words that the entire American maritime establishment had been dreading for 2 years. He said that Henry Kaiser had made traditional wisdom obsolete. And he announced that the United States Maritime Commission would now require all contracted shipyards to adopt Kaiser's methods. The reaction from the traditional shipbuilding world was immediate and total. The yards that had dismissed Kaiser as an ignorant outsider in 1940 now sent their engineers to Richmond to study his approaches.
The president of New York Shipbuilding Corporation, one of the oldest and most prestigious yards in America, visited Richmond in December 1942, and his confidential report to his board of directors is one of the most remarkable documents of the Industrial War. He wrote that Kaiser had achieved what the industry considered impossible by refusing to accept their limitations. He wrote that Kaiser had treated shipbuilding as a manufacturing problem rather than a craft tradition. He wrote that Kaiser had simplified where they sought perfection, standardized where they customized, and trained masses of unskilled workers where they had cultivated generational expertise. And he wrote that the result was ships built in 1/10 the time at 2/3 the cost. The conclusion of his report was stark and unambiguous. The traditional shipbuilding industry must either adopt Kaiser's approaches or accept irrelevance. The numbers that followed through 1943 and 1944 are the numbers of a war being won in factories and shipyards, while it was simultaneously being won on beaches and in jungles and in the air over burning cities. By early 1943, 18 shipyards across America were building Liberty ships using prefabrication and welding. Average construction time had fallen from 230 days initially to just 42 days by mid-1943. The United States was launching 3 Liberty ships every single day. Germany's U-boats were formidable and deadly, but they could not sink 3 ships a day every day indefinitely, and the mathematics of the Battle of the Atlantic began to shift. The supply lines that had been hemorrhaging under submarine attack began to stabilize. The cargo that Britain needed to survive and that the Allied armies needed to fight began to flow with a consistency that the German Naval Command found increasingly impossible to disrupt. Commander Joseph Kenworthy of the Royal Navy, assigned to the British Admiralty delegation in Washington, watched American production with a combination of admiration and something approaching awe. His official reports, declassified in the 1980s, contain a sentence that captures the essential military reality of what Kaiser had accomplished. He wrote that adequate multiplied by thousands defeats perfection multiplied by dozens. The Royal Navy had spent centuries building the finest warships in the world using traditional craftsmanship, requiring years per vessel. The Americans were building adequate ships in weeks, and adequate ships in sufficient numbers were winning a war that perfection alone could not have saved. At peak production in 1944, the full scale of what Kaiser had unleashed became visible in statistics that still seem extraordinary. His 7 yards employed approximately 196,000 workers. The 18 American shipyards building Liberty ships had collectively produced 2,400 vessels. The United States was producing more maritime tonnage than the combined capacity of the rest of the world. The first Liberty ships had required approximately 1.1 million worker hours to complete. By 1943, average worker hours had fallen to approximately 486,000 per ship. Kaiser's most efficient yards, Richmond numbers 2 and 3, were achieving construction in as few as 350,000 worker hours by running 3-shift, 24-hour production schedules and maximizing prefabrication. The cost per ship had fallen from roughly $2 million under just $1.5 million, despite rising wages and material prices, a reversal of the normal relationship between production scale and per-unit cost that reflected the pure power of industrial learning.
Between 1941 and 1945, American yards produced 2,710 Liberty ships. Kaiser's 7 yards alone produced 1,490 of them. Each ship displaced 14,245 tons fully loaded. Each could carry enough cargo to transport 2,840 jeeps, or 440 tanks, or 230 million rounds of ammunition in a single voyage. Powered by deliberately old-fashioned but reliable triple-expansion steam engines, they were not beautiful. They were not technically sophisticated. They were not the kind of ships that naval architects looked at with pride. But they floated. They carried cargo. There were thousands of them, and they were winning a war. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, reflected on this reality in his post-war memoir. He wrote that Japan's military planners had assumed American industrial capacity was impressive but finite. Japan believed that if it sank enough ships, eventually American logistics would collapse and the United States would be forced to negotiate. Nimitz wrote that Japan failed to account for Henry Kaiser. By 1944, the United States was replacing shipping losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The mathematics of attrition had flipped completely. A nation that could build 3 ships daily over a nation that could sink 2 ships daily would win every time, regardless of how much tactical brilliance the sinking side brought to the equation. Nimitz wrote that the Pacific War was won in the shipyards of Richmond and Portland and Baltimore as much as on the beaches of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Industrial capacity, not martial valor alone, determined the outcome. Now here is something that the standard telling of this story almost always misses, and it matters enormously. The Robert E. Peary's construction record was not the end of Kaiser's story. It was not even the most important part of it. What happened after the war tells you something even more significant about what Kaiser had actually accomplished. Traditional analysts expected the wartime shipbuilding boom to collapse the moment the fighting stopped, leaving tens of thousands of workers unemployed and hundreds of costly facilities standing empty and obsolete. The prediction was partly right. Liberty ship production ended in September 1945. By December, Kaiser's workforce had fallen from 200,000 to fewer than 20,000. The Richmond shipyards that had employed 100,000 workers at their peak stood largely empty by spring of 1946. But something happened that the traditional maritime establishment, still fundamentally unable to grasp what Kaiser had actually created, did not expect. The knowledge did not disappear. The prefabrication techniques, the welding procedures, the parallel assembly approaches, the organizational principles of rapid worker training and simplified specifications, all of it went out into the world and kept working. When Japan and South Korea rebuilt their maritime industries in the 1950s and 1960s, they did not reinvent shipbuilding from scratch. They studied Kaiser's Liberty ship program. They went to Richmond and Portland and looked at what he had done, and they took it home and built it into the foundations of shipyards that would eventually dominate world shipping construction for the rest of the 20th century. The massive facilities at Ulsan in South Korea and Nagasaki in Japan, the facilities that built the container vessels and oil tankers that moved the global economy through the post-war decades, were direct descendants of the revolutionary practices that Kaiser had developed on California mudflats while fighting a war. Professor John Bunker, maritime historian at the State University of New York, put it precisely in his definitive study published in 1972. He wrote that Kaiser had entered shipbuilding as an outsider, ignorant of maritime tradition, unconstrained by conventional wisdom, and willing to apply manufacturing principles that the established industry considered inappropriate for ship construction. In 36 months, he built more ships than had been constructed in America during the entire previous century. More importantly, he fundamentally altered how ships would be built worldwide for the remainder of the 20th century. Every modern shipyard, whether building container vessels in Korea or oil tankers in Japan or cruise ships in Europe, uses approaches derived from Kaiser's Liberty ship program. The revolution did not end in 1945. It is still ongoing. It is in every weld, on every modern ship, on every ocean in the world. And then there is the other legacy, the one that has nothing to do with ships at all. Kaiser needed to provide medical care for his enormous workforce, and the traditional American healthcare system of the early 1940s was not equipped to handle 200,000 industrial workers and their families. So Kaiser partnered with physician Sidney Garfield to establish prepaid healthcare programs. You paid into a system in advance, and the system covered you when you needed care. that eventually evolved into Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest health maintenance organizations in American history, serving over 12 million members by the early 21st century, a model of healthcare delivery that influenced American medicine for generations and continues to influence it today. Kaiser came to build ships. He ended up building a healthcare system that has affected more American lives than almost any policy or institution of the 20th century. That is what happens when you give an outsider a problem that experts have decided cannot be solved differently. The workers themselves carried something out of the shipyards that cannot be measured in production statistics. The tens of thousands of women who had proved in Richmond and Portland that they could perform skilled industrial work at professional levels, they did not forget that when the war ended and the social pressure to return to domestic roles intensified. The African American workers who had held skilled positions and earned professional wages in Kaiser's yards, they did not forget what equal opportunity felt like. The young men and women from small towns and farms across America who had discovered in the blue-white light of a welding torch that they were capable of more than anyone had ever told them, they went home different. They raised children differently. They voted differently. They built the post-war American economy with the confidence of people who had already accomplished something everyone said was impossible, and the knowledge that impossible usually just means nobody has organized it correctly yet.
The SS John W. Brown, built in 1942, remains operational as a museum ship in Baltimore as of 2024, 82 years after her construction. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, also built in 1942, is preserved in San Francisco and participated in the 50th anniversary commemoration of D-Day in 1994, actually sailing to Normandy under her own power, 50 years after the beaches she helped supply were stormed by young men who would never come back. These were emergency vessels. They were designed for a 5-year service life. They were built by farmers and housewives who learned to weld in 10 days. They are still here, long after the shipyards that built them have vanished, long after most of the men and women who built them have gone, carrying in their riveted and welded steel the quiet proof that what experts call impossible is very often just something nobody has tried the right way yet. The final accounting of what Henry Kaiser accomplished between December 1940 and September 1945 lives in the record books and the production statistics and the declassified naval reports and the confidential letters of men who started as his skeptics and became, reluctantly and then completely, his converts. But the real final accounting lives somewhere less tangible than that. It lives in every manufacturing facility in the world that uses prefabrication, in every training program that teaches specific skills quickly rather than comprehensive expertise slowly, in every manager who looks at a problem that their industry has been solving the same way for generations and asks, for the first time, why. In every outsider who walks into a room full of experts and refuses to be intimidated by what they know, because they understand that what they do not know might be exactly the perspective the room needs. Kaiser's workers were not superior humans. They were ordinary people, extraordinary in their willingness to show up and learn and work, but ordinary in their backgrounds, their education, their technical expertise at the moment they arrived. What made them capable of the impossible was not anything innate to them. It was organization. It was training. It was a system designed by a man who had never built a ship and therefore had no reason to believe that ships could only be built one way. The Robert E. Peary launched into San Francisco Bay on November 12, 1942, was the single most dramatic proof of this principle in the entire history of American industry. Not because it was the fastest ship built, not because it was the most beautiful, or the most technically sophisticated, or the most strategically important, but because it was visible, because 1,000 workers and a crowd of officials and journalists and competing shipyard owners all saw it happen,
and because newsreel cameras sent the footage into every movie theater in America and the Allied world, and because a maritime establishment that had spent 2 years insisting it was impossible had to watch it slide into the bay and knew in that moment that everything they had believed about the limits of their industry had just been made obsolete by a man who had never built a ship in his life. That is the lesson, not the ships. The lesson. The lesson that traditional wisdom is not the same thing as permanent truth. The lesson that expertise can become the enemy of innovation when it stops asking why and starts only asserting that this is how it is done. The lesson that ordinary people, given proper training, proper organization, and genuine opportunity, can accomplish things that the smartest experts in the room will confidently tell you are impossible, right up until the moment they are forced to watch it happen. 2,710 Liberty ships built between 1941 and 1945. 3,000 years of shipbuilding tradition overturned in 3 years. One man who had never seen a ship built and therefore could see, with perfect clarity, exactly how to build them faster than anyone had ever imagined. Here's the question I want to leave you with. What is the impossible thing in your world, in your industry, your career, your life, that everyone around you has decided cannot be done differently because that is how it has always been done? Because Henry Kaiser looked at 300 years of American shipbuilding tradition and saw not a constraint, but an invitation. The maritime establishment saw their expertise as the ceiling. Kaiser looked at the same expertise and saw the floor. He built everything else above it in 4 days and 15 hours and 29 minutes, and then he watched it slide into the bay while the people who told him it could not be done stood on the shore and tried to figure out what had just happened to everything they knew. If you want to know more about the forgotten stories of industrial revolution that changed the course of the Second World War, subscribe and hit the notification bell because we are just getting started. And if this story gave you the kind of moment where you had to stop and think about manufacturing, about human potential, about what impossible actually means, drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and I guarantee this community will have things to say about it that are worth reading. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that the limits people tell you are real are very often just the limits of their imagination. Kaiser proved it in 1942. The proof is still floating in Baltimore Harbor today.